Ben and Me, Chapter 6, Electricity. Ben never thereafter mentioned my little adventure in printing, so I tried to be somewhat more lenient about his maxims. Trying though they were, however, they were nothing compared to an enthusiasm which beset him about this time. This was the study of what he called electricity. It all started with some glass tubes and a book of instructions sent him by a London friend. These tubes he would rub with a piece of silk or fur, thereby producing many strange and, to me, unpleasant effects. When a tube was sufficiently rubbed, a small bit of paper would spring from the table and cling to it, or crackling sparks leap from the finger of anyone foolish enough to approach. Ben derived great amusement from rubbing a tube and touching it to the tip of my tail. Thereupon a terrible shock would run through my body, every hair and whisker would stand on end, and a convulsive contraction of all my muscles would throw me several inches in the air. This was bad enough, but my final rebellion did not come until he, in his enthusiasm, used the fur cap to rub the tube, and I was in the cap. Ben, I said, this has gone far enough. From now on, kindly omit me from these experiments. To me, they seem a perfectly senseless waste of time. But if they amuse you, all right, go ahead with them. Just leave me out. I fear that you are not a person of vision, Amos, he said. You fail to grasp the epic-making importance of these experiments. You do not realize the force. Oh, don't I replied. My tail is still tingling. I shall tear the lightning from the skies, he went on, and harness it to the bidding of a man. Personally, said I think the sky's an excellent place for it. Top of page 41. Nothing I could say, though, served to dampen Ben's enthusiasm. Soon he received an elaborate machine that could produce much greater currents than the glass tubes. It was worked by a crank which he ground it happily for hours. Our room became cumbered with rods, wires, tubes, copper plates, and glass jars filled with evil-smelling liquids. It was difficult to move about without touching something likely to produce one of those hair-stiffening shocks. Ben even went so far as to organize a group of similarly obsessed people, calling it the Philosophical Society. They gathered once a week, armed with their glass tubes, bits of silk and wire. They spent whole evenings fiddling with these things or listening to long speeches about the wonders of electricity, mostly by Ben. I napped. After he had played with the new apparatus for a few weeks, had it working well, Ben decided to give an exhibition of his achievements in this field. A large hall having been secured for the occasion by the Philosophical Society, Ben spent several busy days arranging it and testing his apparatus, planning various experiments, writing a speech, and inviting prominent people. Frankly, I was bored by the whole affair, but since Ben seemed rather hurt by my attitude, I tried to take a little interest. I read his speech and the descriptions of all the various experiments. By noon, I understood everything quite thoroughly. While we ate a light lunch of bread and cheese, I told Ben of my studies. He was delighted and quite touched by my interest. In the afternoon, he went to have his hair curled, leaving me in the hall, where I went on with my research. Determined that no errors should mar this performance, since it meant so much to Ben, I carefully went over each wire and piece of apparatus, comparing them with his diagrams and descriptions. I discovered that he had apparently made several grave mistakes, for not a few of the wires were connected in a manner that seemed to me obviously incorrect. There were so many of these errors to rectify that I was kept quite busy all afternoon. My corrected arrangement seemed to leave several loose wires and copper plates with no place to go, so I just left them in one of the chairs on the stage. I was barely able to finish before Ben arrived from the hairdresser's. As we hurried home for supper, he was so filled with pride and excitement that I had no opportunity to tell him how narrowly he had escaped ruining the exhibition by his carelessness. When we arrived back at the hall in the evening, the brilliantly lit auditorium was crowded. Seated in chairs on stage were the governor and his lady, the mayor, several of the clergy, and the chief of the volunteer fire brigade holding his silver trumpet. Ben made his speech and performed several, top of page 44, simple experiments with the glass tubes. They were watched with great interest by the audience and generously applauded. He then stepped into the new apparatus and signaled to a young apprentice from the print shop who was stationed at the crank. The lad turned with a will, and loud humming sound came from the whirling wheel while blue sparks crackled about it. "And now, my friend," said Bren proudly, "when I turn this knob, you shall see, if my calculations are correct, a manifestation of electrical force never before witnessed on the continent." They did. As Ben turned the knob, the governor rose straight in the air in much of the same manner that I used to when Ben applied the spark to my tail. His hair stood out just as my fur did. His second leap was higher and his hair even straighter. There was a noticeable odor of burning cloth. On his third rising, the copper plate flew from the chair, landing unfortunately in his lady's lap. Her shriek, while slightly muffled by her wig, was nevertheless noteworthy. The fire chief, gallantly advancing to their aid, inadvertently touched one of the wires with his silver trumpet. This at once became enveloped in the most unusual blue flame and gave off a strange clanging sound. Ben leaped toward them, but I clamped on his ear. I felt those shocks before. "The boy," I hissed. "Stop the machine." He sprang at the apprentice, who was still grinding merrily. The lad, not an admirer of the governor, seized his efforts with some reluctance. The governor was stiff and white in his chair. His lady moaned faintly under her wig. The fire chief stared dazedly at his tarnished trumpet, and the audience was in an uproar. "Never mind, Ben," I consoled as we walked home. "I feel certain that we will succeed next time." "Succeed?" Ben shouted. "Succeed? Why, Amos, don't you realize that I have just made the most successful, the most momentous experiment of the century? I have discovered the effects produced by applying strong electric shocks to human beings." "Granted, the governor is one," I said. "We surely did."